Right, folks, if you want to take your seats, we're at 7 o'clock, so we're going to get this event started. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Heather Birchall, the program manager here, and tonight we're celebrating this new book by Dr. Lerone Martin, Young King, The Making of Martin Luther King Jr. As Dr. Martin notes in his introduction to this really brilliant book, previous biographers of King have rushed over his youth in a hurry to get to his adult years in the civil rights movement. He writes that King was not born a hero. In fact, we find out that he wanted to be a fireman. And it's only by unpacking his background that we can understand the man, minister, and the dreamer. Dr. Martin takes us through King's childhood, his love of sports, dancing the jitterbug, flirting with girls, years as a student at Morehouse College, and finally his marriage to Coretta Scott. He was officially on his way to changing the world. Dr. Martin is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford. He is an award-winning author and public speaker, and his writing and commentary have been featured in numerous established publications. He'll be joined in conversation this evening by Dr. Jorden Sharick, who is the Louisville Institute Postdoctoral Fellow at Stanford's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. That's quite a mouthful, sorry. His postdoctoral research is focused on curriculum development and community engagement projects that invite Bay Area groups into ongoing conversations about the life, faith, and activism of Martin Luther King. You will get a chance to ask questions later, and I'm delighted that Dr. Martin will be staying to sign copies of his book as well after the event. So without further ado, let's welcome our speakers to the stage.
Good evening. So I have to admit that when Lerone asked me if I would join him in Menlo Park tonight for a conversation about his book, I assumed that he meant over dinner. But in front of an audience is cool too. We'll get that conversation started in just a second, but I want to start by posing a rhetorical question to the room. Who needs to answer this question out loud? I want to invite you to think about how you would answer it. One of the summary lines that Lerone has used to describe this book about a young king is something like this: greatness isn't born, it's built. Greatness isn't born, it's built. And I think those lines suggest a couple of follow-up questions. What is it that builds Martin King's greatness? What is it that makes him great? I'll ask Lerone to answer those questions directly near the end of our conversation. But I want to give everyone just a couple seconds to reflect silently on how you would answer the question. What is it that builds Martin King's greatness? What is it that makes him great? I'd also invite you to think about how and whether your answer to that question changes as you listen to Lerone talk about his book. So let's start to have that conversation now. Tell us about how the concept for this book emerged initially. I've heard you say that this project about Dr. King actually owes something to superheroes in Marvel's cinematic universe. So make that connection for us. How is it that this book, Young King, starts with Marvel's Avengers franchise?
Well, first, let me thank you all for being here. I say this sincerely. Anytime someone who's not your mother is interested in your book, it means something. And let my older brother tell it. Even my mother's jibing me, but I appreciate you all being here. This book does have a personal genesis. This is the first book that I've ever written as a dad. And it was important for me to, uh, I was thinking a lot about how to raise little people and how to make sure that they grow up to be people of faith, people of service, commitment, courage. So I thought a lot about that. And at the same time, I started a new job here at Stanford as the MLK professor and um, editing King's papers and overseeing that project. And so I started reading a lot of things about King as a child, things that I had never read before in all my life, and studying Martin King and teaching on Martin King. And I was reading letters about him as a child, writing his parents letters about various different things. And it got me thinking about what is his backstory. It made me think about what is Martin Luther King Jr. like as a child. And all that kind of came together. And in the midst of moving here and getting the kids settled, seeing a lot of Marvel movies, and every Marvel character, as I learned from Benjamin, my 11-year-old, is they all have a backstory. Every superhero has a backstory, and it explains their kind of strength, their moral compass, why they do what they do. And so all of that came together, and I began working on this book about Martin Luther King Jr. And so the book starts with his birth as Michael King. He was Michael King when he was born. And it ends when he and Coretta arrive in Montgomery. So this entire book is a before Martin Luther King Jr. is famous. It's just about what goes into making who he is. And all of that had connections to my personal life and professional life.
Yeah, so in this backstory or origin story that you give us for King, you write about a few traumatic experiences that he has early in his life. I'm thinking of his earliest experiences with racial discrimination in particular. And you say that those experiences start to solidify King's purpose, right? Counterintuitively, maybe they bring into focus for him a sense of inherent dignity and personal worth that he's going to continue drawing on over the course of his life, right? How does King navigate those early experiences with racial discrimination? And what is it, or who is it in the midst of those experiences that begin to transform him into the thinker and leader that he'll become?
King has what he describes as his first memory of racism when he's 6. He says he doesn't have any recollection of thinking about racism prior to this. There is a white family that lives in his neighborhood on Auburn Avenue. They owned a store, and he plays with the kids. They're just friends. They run around together. They play basketball together. They play football together. And then when it's time to go to school, as you would imagine in Jim Crow America, they go to 2 different schools. And King says he runs over to see the boys every day after school to compare notes and talk about school. And the parents keep telling him, no, you can't play with our son. And King never reveals the young man's name. But no, you can't play with our son. No, he's not available. And finally, they tell him, stop coming over. You can't play with our son anymore because you're an N-word. And King says he runs home and crying and asks his mother what happened. And this is the first time King says he ever remembers racism. And a lot of marginalized populations have those memories and those stories. The first time you ever are exposed that something about your identity is somehow marked as inferior, right? And King has this moment, and it's his mother who tries to explain to a 6-year-old boy this thing that we now call racism. And she tries to explain it to him, and she says, as King remembers, this is not biological. There's nothing wrong with you. This is something that's man-made. And she tries to explain to him why they can't ride the buses or why they can't ride the elevator downtown, why they can't shop on Peachtree Street. And she tries to explain all this to him. And then she says, but I want you to remember that you are just as good as any child in Atlanta. And you are somebody. Never lose your sense of somebodyness. And if you recall, King will use that throughout the rest of his life. Jesse Jackson will pick that up and start using that as well. And this is King's earliest lesson in faith and in racism. And King says from that moment on, he starts harboring resentment, first for racism, because it caused him to lose his best friend. But then as he grows older and has a number of violent experiences, he says at years old, around that time, his father takes him to go buy a pair of shoes. They encounter a white salesman. The white salesman says, "I'm not going to serve you unless you sit in the back." And King and his father storm out. He says around 11, he's waiting for his mother outside the grocery store. Common experience for those of us who were kids, holding bags while mom goes to get the car. A white woman comes up and smacks him in his face and says, you're the little N-word that stepped on my foot in the store." So he has all these violent encounters with racism. And so he moves from resenting racism, and he actually says he gets to the point in his life where he begins to resent all white people because of all the violence that's happened to him. And his parents keep preaching to him, "You have to love your enemies. You have to love your enemies." And he says all he remembers saying, and his mother will say this too in interviews, he says, "How can I love some people who have taken away my best friend, who treat me this way and treat us this way? How can I love them?" And so he starts off as a young boy, 11 and 12, saying, "I'm going to be a lawyer because I'm going to fix these conditions that continually produce this kind of violence." And he's bent on being a lawyer. His father, of course, as many of you know, is a minister. King, like a lot of teenage boys, wants to be anything but his dad. So he doesn't want to be a minister, and he set his mind on being a lawyer to try to change the conditions of Jim Crow, but is still very much so rooted in, or fighting against, I should say, the kind of Christian tradition his parents are trying to give to him.
Yeah, so let's continue talking about young King as Martin King's origin story. And this might be too obvious a thing to say, but none of us originate on our own, right? I think you've started to speak to this. King doesn't originate on his own. One of the things I love about this book is that King is almost never alone in the stories that you write. Even if he's the point of those stories, he's not the center of the stories. So you give substantive space to people who don't always receive their due attention. You've talked already about King's mother, Alberta. You write about his grandmother, Jenny, his great aunt, Ida, and people outside of his home too, like the local librarian, Annie McFeeters, and his high school English teacher, Sarah Grace Bradley. What do these women add to our memories of King?
It was important for me to really try to zoom in on the community that made King. And so many of the people part of that community are Black women. And they are the ones who nurture him. So as Jorden mentioned, he has an aunt that lives with them and his grandmother, a great aunt and his grandmother. He's very close with his grandmother. He calls her mama. They're so close. King will say that while no one would ever say it aloud, everyone understood that he was the favorite grandchild. And she's the one that reads to him every evening. She reads to him. She reads a newspaper, encyclopedia. She reads history books. And it's his grandmother and his great aunt Ida who take turns reading to him. And his sister will say, that's how King fell in love with books, was having them read to him, because he gets to be the director, right? The costume designer. As he listens to these stories, he gets to put himself in these books, and he falls in love with books. He has a number of teachers who are amazing, who shape him. And I really related to that because I'm a first generation college graduate. So having important teachers in my life was really important. And I found these stories of these really important women in his life, starting with an elementary school teacher named Elizabeth Lemon. She realizes that King has this amazing memory. And so she encourages him to read Langston Hughes' poetry and then memorize it and perform it in front of the class because he's so gifted. And so King has this teacher who recognizes his gifts, performs in class. He has another librarian at the Auburn Avenue Library named Miss Annie McFeeters. King comes into the library. He wants to read important books, he says. He doesn't want to read kids' books. Enough to check those books out. So she uses his father's name and checks out under Martin Luther King Sr. and kind of sneaks the books to him. And then he comes back in to return the books and they play this word game. He remembers words from the books and then tries to test them out on her and how many ways he can use the words. And she plays these games with him. And then he has an amazing high school teacher, in particular, Sarah Grace Bradley, who was a journalist and an English teacher, recognizes that King is really smart. He asks great questions, this amazing memory, but he does struggle a bit with his punctuation and grammar and his writing. And that's a lot of students, right? Who have gifts, but yet just don't have the skills. And that's Martin King. She realizes this, so she encourages him to start getting into public speaking contests because he's not a great writer, but he has gifts in speaking and memory. So he travels around Atlanta in speech contest. He wins the speech contest at his high school, goes to a state contest, and that's all because of a teacher recognized the gifts and skills. And King will say it's that teacher that gives him his first formal instructions in public speaking. It's not his father, the preacher, it's actually a school teacher. And so it was really important for me in this book to point out all the African American women that helped to shape him. Often we hear about all the great men in the civil rights movement, and those men were important. But these women deserve their flowers as well. They'll never get a monument, right? But they contributed to shaping America through all their students. And they didn't know that this guy would be Martin Luther King Jr., right? They didn't know that. They didn't have that type of foresight, but they had a different type of vision. A vision that if we could treat every child as a valued individual, that child can go and change their community. And that's the type of teachers that King had growing up, and they were phenomenal and helped to shape him.
Yeah, so in addition to this community that you've named, King's parents do play a central role in your book. You've talked about Alberta, you write about Martin Sr., but you've also gestured to the fact that the story you're telling in Young King involves a much broader community of care, right? Only a few of the mentors and teachers that you describe are biologically related to King. And I want to ask a couple questions connected to that. First, what do you think your book has to say to adults about our responsibilities to the young people around us? And then what do you think it has to say to young readers about finding mentors and teachers and communities of care?
I mean, I think for me, I think the story shows the importance of trying to look at children and find gifts and their talents and try to create opportunities for them to exercise those gifts. I think that's one thing. I think another thing that he had the benefit of was a community that allowed him to have an imagination, that he didn't have to continue to live in the world he inherited, that he could actually change the world he inherited. And he had people around him, teachers and parents, who told him that all the time, that he could change the world he lived in. I think that was important. As far as for young adults, I hope what this book will do is give them hope, because this book is filled with stories of Martin Luther King Jr. doing as teenagers do. I mean, there's no cure for being a teenager. We're in the midst of it now. We have a 15-year-old. We're in the midst of it. And that person who's crying is our other one. So I think that, so for example, King's sister will say that he was a very annoying little brother. She will say that he would take her Barbies and dismember them and then hide the body parts around the house, right? The keys were left in his father's car once. He took the car and crashed it. Graduated high school with a 2.7. I think all of these stories that I tried to tell, he dealt with bullies. He got beat up. He didn't like to fight, and his father will say to him, "I'm so tired of you coming home getting beat up." If you come home having been beat up again, you're gonna have to fight me, right? All the stuff that he dealt with, I feel like it's very normal stuff. And I hope that young adults will read this and say, like, he had flaws, he wasn't perfect, but yet he still remained committed to change his community. When I talk to high school students, our students at Stanford, I feel like there's something with a lot of these young adults that something's telling them they have to be perfect in order to serve or be perfect to make a difference. And I hope that this book dismisses that myth for them. All you really need to do is be committed. And that's the one thing that I think that I came away from writing this book and learning about King. He just remained committed even when he wasn't the smartest, wasn't the greatest at the time. He just was committed, and that's what made him great.
So this community that you have described around King to this point is King's hometown community in Atlanta, right? You also write that he has to leave Atlanta and the South altogether to become the person and leader we know him to be. So how does traveling north to Connecticut change King? And I think as importantly, how are those changes related to lessons that he first hears at home in Atlanta?
So this is the one part of King's biography. There are many parts in this book, but this is the one part that's a central turning point in the book. King, Morehouse is losing students because of World War II. They have a early admittance program. He applies at 15 and gets in. And then Morehouse has a program where students who are admitted go to Connecticut for the summer and pick tobacco to make money for tuition. This is when tuition was like $25 a semester, right? The good old days, right? King accepts. He goes with like 105 other men from Morehouse to Simsbury, Connecticut to pick tobacco. And these are the letters that the King Institute published all the way back in the 90s and kind of just sat, and a lot of biographers overlook this. But King writes letters home that summer as 15 years old, the summer of 1944, and he says, this is the first time he's been outside segregated South. These letters say, Mom, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. I'm seeing things I never thought a Black person would see. I went to the movie theater and sat in the front row. I went to the finest restaurant in Hartford, Connecticut, and they seated me. And he's talking about all these amazing things he's experiencing in the North. And his friends say he starts walking around saying that this is God's country, because this must be the way God intended for human beings to live. And while he's there that summer, he actually gives what we know are his first sermons. So he left Atlanta saying he was agnostic. You know, didn't really think God was real. And for some reason that summer in Atlanta, they asked him to lead their devotions every Sunday. And we know this because he writes home and he talks about it. I couldn't figure out why they picked him. I thought it's possible. They knew his dad was a preacher, and so they said, you know, you do it. It's also possible they did it because he was a terrible tobacco worker. The friends in interviews say they voted him the laziest worker of the summer. So he was 5'6", he was 15. That's right, brother, 5'6", and 15. And so I think they're like, this kid's got to do something. And he's always talking and asking questions and talking about changing the world. We got to put him to work. So he ends up being the devotional leader. And he writes home, he's very proud. His mom, Dad, guess what? I'm the head of the religion department. That's what he says in the letters. I'm the head of the religion department. I think that's him trying to imagine himself as a lawyer or professor, right? But he preaches every Sunday during the summer. And so this individual who will spellbound high steeple churches, international platforms, he starts off preaching in ramshackle barns in Connecticut. And everyone who's there says that they remember the sermons being about helping other people and serving other people. That's what they remember the sermons being. And so that summer, he both starts wrestling with maybe being a minister. And secondly, he also starts dealing with his resentment of white brothers and sisters because he's experiencing freedom for the first time. He actually writes a letter home and says, Mom, Dad, you wouldn't believe this. Black people and white people go to the same church up here. And he sings in a choir at an all-white church in Simsbury, Connecticut. The minister of music, he gave an interview with Connecticut Public Television that I found. And he said he heard this 15-year-old in the church singing, this beautiful baritone voice. So he went to him afterwards and said, I want you to sing in the choir. And he said King's response was, where I come from, Black people and white people don't sing together. And the minister of music said, I don't really give a damn about your color. I like your voice. And he sang in the choir that summer. So King starts dealing with all of these things that summer at 15 years old, dealing with his position towards white Americans and also wrestling with whether or not he's going to be a preacher. And at the end of the summer, they come back to Atlanta. They start school at Morehouse. And all of his friends say he can't stop talking about why he shouldn't be a preacher. He's not going to major in theology. He's going to major in sociology. I'm going to be a lawyer. And all his friends say, they tell him, man, you got something. There's something, you got it, whatever that it is. And they say that, talk about why he shouldn't be a preacher. His friend William Pickett got so bad that a lot of guys stopped hanging out with King because they said they wanted to talk about Negro League baseball, basketball, sports, girls, school, and all he wanted to do was somehow steer the conversation back to, and that's why I shouldn't be a preacher. And they said they got tired of hearing about it. So he's wrestling with this his whole time in undergraduate. He's a sociology major. He's trying to convince himself and other people that he shouldn't be a minister. But as I like to say, and I try to tell my boys, he had friends who loved him enough to tell him the truth even when he didn't want to hear it. And that's really important in life, to have people to travel with you who are willing to tell you the truth even when it's tough to hear.
One of the things that I learned about both of us from listening to Heather read our bios is that we both studied religion. So I feel like I should follow up this question about King's time in Connecticut and starting to preach with a question about faith. We often remember King as a person of great faith, but most of this book is about his doubts. So I wonder if you could talk about what you think King's doubts teach us about his faith and what his faith can say to us about ours.
Yeah, he says that he was agnostic primarily because of the death of his grandmother. He's very close to her. He loses her around 11 years old, and he blames himself. She dies in the midst of him telling his parents a lie. So he's supposed to go to evening worship service. He tells his parents, I have a lot of homework to do, I can't go. And instead he sneaks off and goes to a parade. While he's at that parade, she dies. And his 11-year-old brain tells him, it's my fault. God's punishing me. His father says he cries for days, restless nights. His father tries to explain to him, God did not do this. It was just her time. And King just says he becomes angry. He goes to Sunday school. He says Jesus never resurrected. Jesus just died. Death is death. This is the pastor's son. So the church is scandalized, right? He starts fighting in school. Just goes through a really tough time. And he says his teenage rebellion just turned into a rebellion against God in many ways, and just sort of a agnostic. But he says he believes that the fact that he was agnostic and the fact that he doubted so much allowed him to come back to faith on his own terms, not the terms of his parents, not the terms of Ebenezer, but on his own terms, having experienced faith in God. And in fact, he will say that up until that point, faith was just something he breathed in. He was a pastor's kid. He said, I never really thought about it. When he went to the altar in the Baptist tradition to get saved, to give his life to Jesus for the first time, he said he did it because his sister went, and he didn't want her to get ahead of him. There were 6. It's like, she went, I went. He says, I really didn't think about my faith in those types of terms. But in doubting his faith, he enables him to come back to it on his own terms. And I think what it can teach us, I think, is that doubt is not a detour. I think it's a part of the journey. I think that's how you sort of strengthen yourself. Prerequisite of faith. You got to have doubt before you can sort of trust, right? And so I think it tells us that's a part of the journey. And I think that King can show us that. And he will say as an adult, he's thankful for that period of doubt because it allowed him to his faith to be stronger and actually be thought out and not simply just inherit what his parents gave him.
So let's talk about Coretta. The second to last chapter in the book's longest chapter is titled Coretta. Tell us about why you felt like it was important to bring the book to a close with this focus on the woman that will become King's partner. So how does knowing Coretta Scott help us to understand the history around Martin King?
I just felt it was so important to focus on the person that will walk beside him and help him be the Martin King that we come to know. Andrew Young said that if it wasn't for Connecticut, we never would have gotten the Martin Luther King Jr. we got. And I think the same could be said if it wasn't for Coretta, we wouldn't have the Martin Luther King Jr. we had. So I really went into their love story in this book. It's the longest chapter. They're introduced in Boston in 1952. King is doing his PhD, second semester. Coretta's studying at the conservatory. They are introduced over the phone, like a lot of couples, I guess, these, right? And King calls her up, and she says he immediately rushes in and starts complimenting her and quoting poetry and Shakespeare. And she literally said, she stopped him and said, "You haven't even seen me." And he said, "But from what I've heard of you, you're beautiful, and I just can't wait to see you." And he said, "Please have lunch with me, please." And she said, "I'm busy. I'll have to check my schedule." He said, "Please, every Napoleon has his Waterloo, and I've met my Waterloo. I'm on my knees. Please, please." So she said she rolled her eyes, but said sure. So they had lunch that week. And Coretta says in her own recollections, she talks about this a bit in her book, My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., but that was ghostwritten. Where I received most of this information was the interview she gave to the ghostwriter, where she's much more frank. It's not cleaned up. She says he pulls up in this little green Chevy. His dad bought him. It's February in Boston, so you know the weather. She's on the corner with her raincoat on. And she says she sees his little green Chevy come around the corner. She sees and he tells her, "I have a green Chevy. Normally it takes me 10 minutes to get to your school, but tomorrow for you, baby, I'm gonna do it in 7." So she sees a little guy coming around in his car, and she says later on, she's thinking, that is a really small car, and he fits in that car very well. I don't know in that car with him. Because she said, I've always liked tall men. Clearly, he's not going to be tall, right? And the doctor's records that we have says that he's 5'6.5", right? We're guessing that's without shoes. We're not sure. So anyway, she says, he pulls up, she gets in the car, and she says, as they're driving over to the cafeteria to have lunch, she's looking him over and she's thinking, he is so unimpressive looking. His hairline is receding. He's got really small ears. And he says later on, he's thinking like, oh my God, she's gorgeous, right? As he's driving the car. And they sit down. She says she takes her raincoat off, and she tells an audience of African-American college students about this. She says she took her raincoat off, and he stared her up and down. He's googly-eyed. He's so excited. Compliments her on her hair. And she's really ready for this to be over. And then he starts talking about the world he wants to live in. That he wants to live in a world where there's no Jim Crow. He wants to fight against poverty. He wants to engage in nonviolence. He doesn't believe in war. He doesn't believe in materialism. And she said, she looks at him and says to herself, Dear God, he's becoming handsome right before me. And she said it's because she never heard a minister talk that way before. And that's the world that she wanted to live in. And what most people don't give her credit for, which is why it was so important for me to spend time with her in this book, is that she's the experienced activist when they meet, not Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, King will give an interview on television, and this reporter will ask him, "How did you teach your wife about how to be an activist?" And King chuckles and says, "Actually, it's the other way around. She taught me." And he will say that, in fact, when I met her in 1953, she was already doing the things that we're doing now in 1965. So Coretta was the experienced activist, and he knew that. And he, I think, was very clear about wanting to have a partner in life to work with him. So the date ends, he drops her off, he puts the car in park, and he turns to her and says, "You have everything I've ever wanted in a wife. When can I see you again?" And she says, she tries to play it off, you know, he's 24 at the time, she's 25. She tries to play it off. And she says, "I don't know, but you may call me." And she gets out the car. And then the rest of the chapter is about their sort of courting and love affair going back and forth. She doesn't want to marry a minister. She's a singer. She plans to travel the world and sing, to use her art as a protest mechanism. He's very clear about being a minister and going back south. And so their dating experience is a game of cat and mouse. She's kind of playing hard to get at times. She admits this. She says so herself. He's frustrated. So he does little silly things like men do with their egos, like takes her to a party where there's a bunch of girls he knows that like him and tries to make her jealous. They do things that when you do, and no offense to the young adults in the room, when you're in your 20s and stupid. And this goes back and forth for some time. And then finally, Coretta said she's been praying about this and praying and praying and praying. And finally, through a series of events, she agrees to marry him. And this is how we end up getting the civil rights power couple that we know.
So I want to ask two more questions and then transition to audience Q&A. So at the King Institute, we often talk about wanting to do work that brings people into conversation with Martin King. I think we have a good sense now for the ways that young King contributes to that conversation. I wonder where you imagine the conversation going from here. So how do you want people to engage with the work that you're doing in this book and to build upon that work?
I mean, I think I'll say two things. First is that I hope that it humanizes King for all of us and allows all of us to say that we can use our time, our talent, our treasure to contribute to justice. You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be the smartest, you just need to be committed. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing as relates to Martin King and scholarship is I think, as I say in the beginning of this book, I think too often minority children, especially African American children, often don't get the benefit of adolescence. They are, we know this from studies, right? They're often viewed as older, bigger. If they're girls, they're often overly sexualized at a young age, right? I wanted to write a book to remind people that this was a child. And when people talk about him, they forget this is somebody's baby. This is somebody's son and brother. And I think it's important to realize that in scholarship on King in general. But then in 2027, we're probably going to get the rest of the FBI's purported surveillance on King. And I think it's important that we recognize his humanity. And I hope that this book will do that in the midst of the FBI releasing their documents where they're going to try to paint him as someone who is immoral or someone who is violent. And I think that all of that first is mostly all false. But secondly, I hope this book will remind people to have a bit of humanity, to not get caught up in a kind of TMZ celebrity gossip type approach, but more so of an approach of of humanity. This is a human being who was not perfect, but certainly is someone we can understand and relate to. And I think when he's an icon, for us to relate to him, he seems other, somehow different than the rest of us. I think this book makes it show that he's very much so like all of us in this room. We have a shared humanity. And I hope that we can recognize that in people in our community and, of course, in Martin King.
Yeah, I want to end my questions and then I'll give you all a chance to ask a question by returning to the two questions that I asked at the start. So if some pesky interviewer were to ask you to summarize your book in 1 or 2 sentences by answering these 2 questions, how would you do it? What is it that builds Martin King's greatness? What is it that makes King great?
I think for me, it's commitment. So many of you know his at his funeral, he had preached a sermon before his funeral called "The Drum Major Instinct," and he talked about Jesus's definition of greatness. And Jesus's definition of greatness is that anybody can be great because anybody can serve, right? So King preaches this sermon, and he says, you know, when I die, I'm not going to have any money to leave behind. And I don't want people at my funeral to talk about the awards I've won. I don't want them to talk about the degrees I've got. I want them to talk about the fact that I tried to serve and that I tried to leave a committed life. That sermon is played at his funeral as his eulogy. He eulogizes himself, right? And I think that this book, when I hear that sermon, it moves me because I feel like in writing this book, I feel like I want to say, you did it, man. Of all the mistakes, crashing to your dad's car, doubting faith, you know, dating, all these things, dancing, all these things. At the end of the day, he remained committed. And I've completely broken your rule of 1 sentence. I know that. But I think that's how I would answer it, is that King lived a committed life, and that doubts, failure, they're detours, they're part of the journey.
Thank you. So I think we'll start to take questions now. Heather is going to come around with the microphone.
I enjoy feeling like I'm just having a cup of tea with you and hearing these stories. I have 2 20-year-olds, 20-somethings, and they are activists. And they grew up with a religious background, kind of Jewish Christian. It was a religious Christian cult, and so it's really tainted their faith. And they're in the midst of their activism is trying to, like, it's hard as a mom to see their doubt, but I know that's part of their journey. So I just want to say that everything that you shared here touched me deeply as a mother. And I think that this is a book that I'm going to read, and I want my children to read. So it's less of a question and more of a deep gratitude.
Thank you.
What surprised you the most? You did a lot of research, obviously, et cetera. Some things left out, maybe that surprised you. Some things that surprised you that are in the book. What surprised you the most? And I have a follow-up question.
Okay. I think what surprised me the most was the doubt. You know, we see him in these images, these videos, and speaking of shirt and tie. It just always seems like he's got it figured out and he's already prepared, right? It almost feels like, and Christine says this, that people sometimes approach him as if he arrived just ready to do battle with Jim Crow. And I think I fell into that trap, and I think finding him talking the interviews about his teenage life and the doubt that he went through, I think that probably was the most surprising. And I think the second thing was that we haven't really asked him these questions. I mean, if you Google books on Martin Luther King Jr., they're going to come up with thousands of hits. And I just kept thinking, why have we never asked these questions? Like, who were you, Martin King, as a little boy? Like, who and what shaped you? And I think that also surprised me, that I was writing this and it never really, these questions hadn't been asked. And I get why. He lived such a momentous life. And so when people write on him, they typically want to rush through the childhood and get to the momentous life, to the Montgomery bus boycott, right? To Birmingham, to the March on Washington, and so forth. But none of that's really possible in some ways without the backstory. So
My follow-up question, sort of two unrelated questions, but one is the sermons that you spoke of in Connecticut exist in files? Like,
not. They've been lost to the dust of time. The only way that I was able to do it is there were several older men who were there working as foremen and fellow students who gave interviews to Connecticut Public Television around, and interviews in the 50s and 60s, and then later about that summer. The other thing I'll tell you that surprised me, and this is historically we're not quite sure about it, is that it's possible, and I have a short chapter just called Malcolm, because it's possible that summer, like King is there doing that preaching, it's possible Malcolm X was in that area. So on King's 15, Malcolm's 19. And Malcolm is working for a clothing tailor in Boston. And his job is to go around to these small farms where all these African American Southern migrants are growing tobacco and sell suits. And there are people who are there who remember buying suits from Malcolm. And the Morehouse Student newspaper says when the students come back from the 1944 summer, they all got brand new suits. So it's possible. I don't have the evidence. And my editor kept reminding me of this, like, you're getting excited, Lerone, like, you don't have the evidence for this. Just say that Malcolm's in the area. And it's very possible the two could have crossed paths. They would have never known. We know the only time they publicly met was in 1964 in March, when they were both visiting Congress to listen to them debate the Civil Rights Bill. They didn't have the time to say, where'd you spend your summer in 44? They didn't have the time to do that. But that we know that they're probably in the same area. And it's a really fascinating moment to think about two individuals whose lives will be so close, but yet so far away, that starts when they're teenagers.
Hi. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for writing this book. What was the catalyst or driving force that compelled you to deal with him as a young boy moving forward?
Definitely my own personal life, raising children, and reading these letters about King, writing home to his parents, and realizing that they never really had been covered. And then finally, because I went to divinity school, King, in his divinity school application, they asked him, give us an account for your reason to want to study for the gospel ministry. And King writes in shaky cursive, my reason is not like most other reasons. He says, there's nothing miraculous. It just, in the summer of 1944, I started feeling an urge to serve. And I wanted to know what happened in the summer of 44. And that's what got me going and thinking about summer of 44 and his childhood, and just thinking about how he became Martin Luther King Jr.
And then lastly, have you gotten any feedback from his children on the book?
I haven't. I do engage with the family because of my position. I gave them a copy when it was just a Word document, so they could read it ahead of time. I've not received any feedback about that, but I certainly did share it with them. I wanted them to know before the book came out, before the world saw it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. The book was amazing. In reading the book, I almost felt like I'm looking in someone's home and I shouldn't be paying attention and see all these level of details. And it definitely is a great walkthrough of becoming. And I thought about like what challenges did you face? And even you talked about understanding there's an importance in terms of starting in the 1944 era, but you could just keep going and going. Like, so how did you determine like how the book ended? And then did you run into what was your greatest challenge in writing this?
It's a great question. I stopped in Montgomery just because I wanted to let's stick with young King. Let's stick with this person before he's famous, before the world knows him. I wanted to stick with that. I think the challenge was um, I couldn't find enough information on the fact that, as you probably remember, there's a chapter called "The Police." I couldn't find more information about what happened exactly. I wanted to. King is stopped by the police in 1947, and he goes back to Connecticut. I believe he goes back to Connecticut in 47 because he's accepted his call to preach, but he hasn't told his parents yet. But he wants to go back to where it all began, is what I believe. And then that summer, he's stopped by the police. And I was trying to find court records and newspaper clippings. I couldn't find exactly what happened. So what I did was, as you may recall, I just talked about what was going on at the time around him. That there's all this concern from the FBI and local police about all these Black migrants flooding into Connecticut. And the cops start saying it's an invasion, shoot to kill. And so there's all this concern. Then I found testimonials from Jamaican men who also were in Connecticut working on these tobacco farms. And they talked about being stopped by the police and harassed anytime they left the farms. So I had to kind of write around it exactly what happened to him. All we know is that his friends said that he got stopped by the police that summer, and it was pretty eye-opening for him. And I think that's important because people often talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey, that when he came to Chicago in 1966, he was like, oh my God, there's racism in the North, right? But King knew that as a teenager. He knew the limits of Northern freedom by getting stopped by the police. There's no Jim Crow signs, but there's still racism in the North. And so it was an important chapter for me to write, but that was probably more challenging. And then finally, I'd say there's just certain moments that I felt challenged to write about because they're not always the most flattering. But I stuck to it because I thought this is what it means to be human. And I tried my best to be gracious in writing it and not to say that this determined his character. This was just a silly thing that he did. And so I think that was the other challenge.
Hi, I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian Church Palo Alto, where you will be speaking on June 10th at 7 p.m. for anybody who wants to see you again. And I'm here to kind of hear what you had to say. So before you come to my church, but I was just floored in a connection that we have when you were talking. My brother is also a minister, my older brother, and he's a UCC minister and served for 10 years at the First Congregational Church of Simsbury, Connecticut. And they wear King's participation in the choir there as a badge of honor, and it's a good liberal white people church, right? My brother's also, his wife is Filipino, and their daughter was Marshallese. And so they very much experienced being one of the only two people of color in that church today, and were welcomed, but also experienced racism there. And I don't even know if I have a question except that King experienced this wonderful inclusion, but also racism. And now here that church is proud of King's participation, also continuing to be racist. I don't know what my question is.
No, man, first of all, that's amazing. Thank you for telling me that. And secondly, it was an amazing segue for the plug. I appreciate that. But there is, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but there is a a Methodist church in town that your brother's probably familiar with, that actually does turn away many of the African American Morehouse men who try to go there. Because there's also white college students, white women in particular, who've been brought up from Florida to work for the summer. And the Methodist church, these white women tell the Methodist church, we refuse to go to church with these Morehouse guys. So you need to make a choice. And the Methodist church in town makes the choice. They choose the white students. And so King, I don't know if King went with them, but that did happen as I looked through local newspapers of that time. And so I don't know if that's how King lands on your brother's church. If he had that experience, he didn't speak about it, but it does happen at that time. So you're absolutely right. There's racism that happens there in the town, even in terms of worship. It's a commentary that King will say, of course, later, right? That the most segregated hour in America is 11 a.m. on Sunday, right? And so when he says that, he's saying that from experience.
Okay, one more question.
I think right here in the gray Patagonia.
Thank you for writing this book. That's really profound. So I had a question about his doubting.
Yeah.
When in his life did he start changing? Like, what made him pivot to faith? Like, what were there some events or what happened to kind of change his perspective?
He says that in particular, it's Connecticut, but it's also, that's when the urge, he said, starts. But then he says 2 professors helped him a great deal. Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, who's president of Morehouse, he says that Mays gives him an image of a minister. Mays has a PhD. He believes in the Bible, but he also believes in modern science. And Mays is also an activist. He's protested the segregation on the railroad. He's running a university. And King says that Mays just sort of really, he's taken with Mays. He stays after, Mays speaks every Tuesday in chapel, stays after chapel, pesters him with questions. His friends say that King is so taken with him, he tries to start dressing like Mays as a college student. They tease him about it. They call him Little Benny. And the second person is Dr. George Kelsey, who was King's Bible professor. And King says that George Kelsey taught him how to look beyond stories in the Bible where animals talk, seas spread, and to go behind those stories and find inescapable moral truths. And King says that he had never really had anyone do that before. His father was more of a fundamentalist preacher. And it's the only class at Morehouse that King gets an A. It's Bible. It's the only class. So full-year class. And King says it's Kelsey that helps him say, okay, I can believe in modern science and still believe in the Bible and actually preach. And he says it's those 2 things that really help him get over this. And William Pickens, who's a classmate of his, says he sees King that spring of 1947, and King sees him on campus at the dining hall and says, I figured it out. Like, I figured out how I can be a minister. Like, I got it now, how I can serve and still be a respectable man who has an education and still serve. So it seems like it's those period of years in Morehouse that are really important. And I just want to pause and say, that was important for me to tell that story because so many biographers treat Morehouse as if it's not important in King's life. They always go to his theological seminary at Crozier, and then they go to Boston University and talk about the professors there. I understand that those professors were important. They helped King learn sort of the political tradition and theological tradition of Protestant liberalism. But he doesn't arrive there a blank slate. And these professors, he says, are the ones that shaped him. And I think that it's important that if you're going to write about somebody's life, you listen to what they have to say about themselves.
Okay. Big round of applause. that was really wonderful. We are going to do a selfie in a second. I cannot urge you strongly enough to go and buy this book. It is so readable. You just kind of zip through it. The narrative is stunning. The writing is incredible. Having read the book and hearing you speak, I wanted you to speak in the way of the book, and you have, and you've really brought it down to earth for us. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jorden, for being such an excellent moderator. Okay, folks, I've got a favor to ask. Everybody who's got a book, if you could hold that up, and then I'm just going to take a selfie with the crowd. So I hear. And can we give a round of applause for Lerone's socks as well? They are the best socks of the season so far. Okay. Yes. Try and everybody hold your books up. Yeah, go ahead.